Okay, when we think of the law, most people will say the Ten Commandments. That's the law. Actually, it's not. When the term law or Torah is used of the commands and regulations, there are some 613. And while theologians tend to separate out the Ten Commandments from the rest of it, the Bible doesn't, except in terms of grouping. When the Old Testament uses the word Torah, which is most often translated law in our English Bibles, it really does not mean restrictively rules and regulations that have penalties that you can be convicted for violating. It really has a much broader meaning. It means instruction. It means the whole way that God, in a codified form, including laws, including regulations, gave His people direction, gave them the means that they needed in order to function as the nation, the priest nation that He was calling them to be. And so we noted that that the law has a number of purposes, a number of things. It was a gracious gift of a father to a son who wants this son to know how to live appropriately to who he is as the father's son. And this was Israel's destiny. It was a constitution. They were to be a nation. A nation had a distinctive way about doing things. The interesting thing is that Egypt did not have law. The one country that didn't. The reason they didn't is the Egyptians looked at Pharaoh as God, and God's word was law. So whatever Pharaoh said, that was law. You get later on, for instance, the Medes and the Persians, and you'll read in Daniel, and they had laws, and once the laws were put on the books, the king couldn't violate them. The law of the Medes and the Persians can't be violated. Which is why in Esther you couldn't just say, oh, well, we had a law that you could go around and kill all the Jews. I can't just obliterate that law. He let them defend themselves instead. And so law is different from nation to nation, but they needed some way to be able to show that they belong to this God of heaven and earth. And so what you find in the various aspects of the law, and we'll come back to this in a little bit here, gives them this distinctiveness. If they paid attention to this instruction, if they allowed God to train them as His son nation, as the priest nation, they would have quite a distinctive flavor. They would have a very distinctive life among the peoples of the ancient world. And so it served as a constitution. And countries today are set off by their law, by their what it is that governs them and how that works. We see that in the Scriptures themselves indicate that God had done this with no other nation. And so it was a constitution. It was a covenant. It was actually the form, the means by which the nation was marked out as belonging to God and marked out as having certain obligations and taking upon themselves the obligations of the covenant. And so it was, while it was all these other things, was also a covenant contract. It was a treaty between the king and his people. And it will be referred to as covenant throughout the rest of the Old Testament. When we get to Jeremiah next semester, and we will look at how God is going to accuse them of breaking the covenant. It is this covenant that He will be referring to. The covenant that they made with their fathers, and through the fathers to them these hundreds of years later. So it's a contract. It's a contract between God and the nation of Israel, whereby they are obligated to serve Him. And they're obligated to obey what He has said. Another thing that the law was, and I think this is about where we got to, wasn't it? Was that it guaranteed Yahweh's presence. It guaranteed His presence. In Exodus 33 and 32 is where we find the golden calf while Moses is up on the mountain, and the nation really before they can ever get off the ground, they violate the whole thing. And they set up this golden calf, and it's like their god. It's a god, and it replaces, and it violates the first of the Ten Commandments, the general stipulations. And so this breach has to be rectified, and this is what we find in chapters 33 and 34. And God tells Moses, he says, look, I'm just going to wipe these people out, and I'll start over with you. And Moses is really praying to God on the basis of the agreement that he'd made with Abraham and what he had already done with the people. And so he says, how then will it be known that your people and I have found grace in your sight, except you go with us? And Moses is also saying, I can't lead this people up. And because of the breach of covenant, God says in that context, I can't be present with them in the fullest sense and the way I would like to be. You take them up. And Moses says, if you aren't present with us, there's no sense in going up. And he was right, and God knew that, and God was providing for a way for him to be present with them. And that was through the what was given in this Torah, in this instruction. Because this had to do not only with the civil regulations, but it also had to do with their religious, how they would carry out their worship, how they would carry out their religious life. And so in that, he provided a way for them to be for him to be present with them. And it had to do with the tabernacle, the temple, the sacrificial system, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But this is another thing that Torah did, is it guaranteed his presence with them as they would be responsive to it. So we shall be separate, your people and I, from all the people who are on the face of the earth. And God was to be with them in a special way, in a unique way. And this was what was going to set them apart from all the rest of the nations. And Torah was the key to that, how his presence would be manifested and how they could know it. Again, next semester when we look at Ezekiel, we're going to find that by that point in Israel's history, hundreds of years after this, the covenant has been broken so severely and the people have gotten so far off track that God's presence actually leaves the nation. And it leaves the temple in terms of the Shekinah glory, and God then destroys the temple. And that's something that Israel just thought would never happen. That was unthinkable. But God's presence with the nation is critical with regard to what his purpose was with the nation. And we will see this Shekinah glory cloud taking up residence in the tabernacle. You've read that. It will also do the same in the temple. And so God's presence with the people, as is seen in various ways, is all important in regard to Israel's function. They weren't a nation like any other nation. They had God as the one who created them and the one who was present with them. The other thing is that the law gave them the opportunity to be a blessing. Again, looking at Exodus 19:5 and 6, now therefore, if you will obey my voice indeed and keep my covenant, you shall be a peculiar treasure. I don't know why I use that translation. Peculiar means special. We don't use this word like this anymore. In fact, you probably don't use this word at all. A special treasure, a unique treasure unto me above all people. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. The special treasure here, the Hebrew word, is actually found used of kings, certain possessions of kings in the ancient Near East. A king really owned everything in the country. Anything he wanted, he could take. So a king, while he had absolute sovereignty over his whole territory, if he said, I like that farm is mine, it was his. And so really he controlled and had the use and could make the use of anything and everything in his kingdom, including people. But other people could use those things as well. But there were some things that would be only the king's. Nobody else would share usage of those things. And this word has that idea. And so God is calling the nation of Israel His special, unique treasure, His special, unique possession, set apart for His and His use only, which is why He had obligated Himself to redeem them out of Egypt. And so this Torah, this instruction, indicated how it is they would serve and fulfill that unique, special purpose. And that is to be the instrument, the national instrument of bringing blessing to the earth. Remember, God had told Abraham that's what He was going to do. And He was going to do it through a nation that would come from him. And there are various facets to that, including the birth of Messiah and the spiritual enrichment that He brings, and Him being the key to all this. But nonetheless, that's what Torah did. And finally, it was also, this is in addition to what Balis indicates, it was instruction for Israel's growth and service. Deuteronomy 8, 5, and 7, you should know in your heart that as a man chastens his son, so the Lord your God chastens you. This is a word that is used characteristically in Proverbs. In fact, it is one of the key concepts in Proverbs. And it has to do with child training. It has to do with the process of bringing up a child, of giving a child instruction and giving a child correction when the child goes off path from that instruction, of bringing discipline to a child for violations in order to correct their way, all with the purpose of that child coming to walk in the path of wisdom. And this word is used here in Deuteronomy to indicate that this is what God had been doing with them. This is the second generation. Therefore you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God, to walk in His ways and to fear Him, for the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land. And again, walking in a pathway and fearing God are key concepts in Proverbs with regard to the raising of children. And so the law was, Torah was God's instruction in the training of His child, the training of His son, Israel, to be the priest nation. And so as they responded to this, they would mature, they would grow, both in their understanding of who they were and what they were to do, and in their ability to do it. And they would come to serve God in an acceptable way. So Torah served all of these purposes. In the New Testament, we will find an emphasis on law being that which condemns and shows us our need for Christ, and that is a purpose of law in its general sense. But that goes beyond and is beyond how it is given to us in the Old Testament. And so realize that this was God's gracious provision by which the nation could come to function as He had created them and what He had created them for. Now we come to the general stipulations of the covenant, the Ten Commandments. And I mentioned that when ancient Near Eastern kings would enter into treaties with their vassal nations or vassal kings, those who would serve them, those who would be in subject to them, they would often give them two forms of rule, two forms of laws, two forms of stipulations, the requirements that they were to take upon themselves. And there would be general principle-type statements of expectation, and then there would often be some specifics, specific things that they were to do, which would carry out, which would give them an indication of how those general guidelines would be worked out, how they would be fulfilled. And in the Ten Commandments section of the covenant, of the book of the law of Torah, which occurs in Exodus chapter 20, and it will occur again in almost exactly the same form in Deuteronomy chapter 5. We really find it breaking down into two parts, and this is observed by all who study this. But the first part, no other gods, no carved images, not misuse the name of the Lord, and to rest on the Sabbath, all are focused almost entirely toward God, toward who He is and respecting who He is. The second part, and notice that I've repeated rest on the Sabbath, honor parents, not murder, not commit adultery, not steal, not bear false testimony, and not covet. Those have more to do with the relationships on a horizontal plane between people. Now, I indicated, and you saw this in the statement of the illustration of the ancient Near Eastern covenants, that the primary purpose for the ancient kings was to maintain the loyalty of these subject peoples, of these subject kingdoms. And so we can actually say that in a real sense, that is what is going on also in the Bible. That God is saying, here is the general principle, here are the general principles by which you will show and maintain your loyalty to me and to others as those who belong with you in this covenant nation, in this covenant context. And so we can see a parallel between this. Now, with the ancient Near Eastern kings, it was very simply a matter of loyalty and very simply a matter of control. He was concerned for maintaining the control of his kingdom, maintaining the security of his kingdom. One of the reasons that kings, powerful kings, would conquer nations around him is so that he would have a buffer from kings who were equally as powerful as him or more powerful than him. And so in the ancient Near East, this whole thing of entering into these treaty agreements and to affect the loyalty of the subject peoples had really one purpose, and that was the security of the king and his kingdom, the protection of the king and his kingdom. And that was the only purpose it had. Now, he acted like he was such a good guy. He would say all the wonderful things he had done for them, and they would even use the language of love. You know, I've loved you and so forth. But it was a covenant contractual sort of thing. And if these people got out of line, he would have no qualms about wiping them out, going in and just smacking them. All right? When God makes a covenant with the nation of Israel, it goes far beyond that. Because they are not only a nation that He has taken to Himself, but we've also seen that the nation is His son. And He's going to care for the nation as a child. He is not simply going to look at the nation of Israel as the means by which He would maintain His control over the earth. Does He need a nation to do that? Obviously not. He is the Lord of heaven and earth, the creator of heaven and earth. He creates the nations. He's the one who determines when nations come into being and where they're going to be and how long they're going to be. It tells us that in Acts chapter 17. So God is not, did not create the nation and enter into a treaty relationship with them in order to secure His kingdom on earth. He didn't need it. It had a much more important, a much more lofty goal. And that was He wanted to display His goodness. He wanted to display His love. He wanted His salvation to be able to be known and experienced by other peoples in other nations. And so we will find that God does not take the same hostile action toward the nations to the extent that other kings would, because He has a training purpose. He has a long-term commitment to the nation. He has a relationship with the nation which antedates, which happens before He enters into this covenant with them. It's just like your parents gave you rules when you were growing up. Anybody not have any rules when you're growing up? We all do. You have to, all right? And when you violated those rules, what kinds of things happened? Spanking. Can you say that? Huh? Okay. Some sort of negative consequence, all right? Was anybody ever disowned? By your parents. Yeah, siblings disown each other all the time. I'm talking about by your parents. Anybody ever go down to the courthouse and say, I disavow the relationship here, I unadopt them, I unborn them, I unparent them? No. Sometimes parents feel that way, and sometimes parents act that way in abandoning children, but that's not the way parents are. You know, a parent and a child have a relationship that cannot be changed. The fellowship does undergo different types of experience. And it's the same way with God. He brought the nation of Israel into existence by His sovereign grace, by an act that they had nothing to do with. And so by that act, it's like the birth of a child. They became His son. Now, they enter into a relationship with Him whereby they take upon the obligations of a servant of the priest nation. And there are conditions, and in that sphere there are consequences. But God's relationship with the nation of Israel goes beyond and is deeper and is founded on something permanent, something far greater than a contract, a covenant. So understand that this covenant, that this contract is working in the realm of informing Israel as to how they will carry out their mandate of servanthood, how they will serve their Father, God, among the nations. And it does not establish their relationship. Therefore, as we will see later on, the breaking of this covenant can't sever their relationship with God, their ultimate relationship and connection with God. And that will have a lot to say about a prophecy. So while loyalty is here in terms of function, it has something far greater at stake than simply the loyalty of kings in the nations to their countries. But nonetheless, these are the general stipulations. These are the general guidelines that all of the specific laws are going to show how they work out and how this is to be worked out. And so understand the place of these 10 commands, 10 commandments in the covenant. This is not the whole of the law, but this is at the heart of it, because they are an expression of the character of God, which informs the behavior of the people. Now with that, I want to return to something that Bayless says about law. All nations had law, well, except for Egypt. I think he mentions that. Law codes are common in the ancient Near East. One that you may well have looked at in your high school education, maybe even before, is the Code of Hammurabi. And it's a fairly extensive law code, but even it isn't a full law code, and they've discovered a lot in studying these law codes. But there are differences. There are similarities, but there are also differences between the kinds of regulation, the kinds of statutes and judgments that we find in Torah, and the kinds of laws we find in other nations. And when we compare those, it gives us another view of the distinctive of Torah and of the distinctive of the nation and what it was that God was trying to do with the nation. For instance, biblical law places a primary concern on human life. It does not place a primary concern on property. And that's what we find in other law codes, is that human life was much less valuable in other societies. But as we will look at the law code and compare it in the biblical material, we find that the primary concern is on human life. Humans are created in God's image, in His likeness, as His image, to be His representatives upon earth. And therefore, human life is dear to God. That's revealed in the Ten Commandments. It's revealed in the specific stipulations of both Exodus and Deuteronomy. And that is a heightened, there is no other ancient law code that shows and guards through law and regulation the value of human life like the biblical law code. Secondly, biblical law involves an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Now, when we read that, we think that sounds very harsh. In reality, again, it is a more equitable system of penalty, system of this for that than other ancient customs. What this is saying if somebody puts out your eye, all you may do is put out their eye. Now, it is not to be taken in a literal sense necessarily. What it is saying here, using the metaphor, is that the punishment must fit the crime. In other societies of the ancient world at this time, you would find that the punishments would be far severer than the crime. Thirdly, biblical law judges crimes against property more leniently. Does anybody have bailiffs with them? I had this last week and didn't. Could I use your book just for a moment? I just want to... Anybody have bailiffs with them from creation to the cross? Did you give it to me? Thanks. Yeah, so under this, on page 125, he talks about crimes against property. Other cultures at this time tended to value property even above human life. And he says, though the Bible judges crimes against people more strictly than earlier laws did, it is less strict than those laws in judging crimes against property. For instance, the Mosaic law normally requires double restitution for theft. Hammurabi requires 10 to 30-fold. If the thief cannot pay the restitution, Hammurabi has him killed. Okay? Exodus allows him to work it off as a slave. Now, you see, when we read that, we think, oh, they could become slaves of each other? How backward, how cruel, how antiquated. Well, in terms of the societies that they were in, that was progressive. It was kind. Because you see, a Hebrew slave could be redeemed, and every so often the law said they're just let go. So you see the valuing of human life against property. If you're a thief, you would rather be one under the Mosaic law. If you're caught tunneling through someone's mud wall, the homeowner can kill you and ask questions later, but only if it happens at night. That's the Mosaic law. Hammurabi will punish you with death day or night, and the hole you made would be filled with your corpse and plastered over. The laws of Eshnunna let you off with a fine during the day, but requires your death at night. Biblical law regards even the life of a thief as worth something and tries to protect it. Without a prison system, options for punishment in the ancient world are fewer. They include capital punishment, fines, mutilation. In Assyria, a wife can lose her nose or ear for varying degrees of unfaithfulness. No doubt an effective way to cut down on her desirability, I guess. If you're a surgeon, Hammurabi requires that your hand be cut off if anyone dies under your knife, but the Bible avoids using bodily mutilation as a penalty. So the whole valuing of human life, under other codes, if somebody kills a child, his child will be killed. Well, yeah, that would be a punishment for him. What about his child? The Bible doesn't allow that sort of thing. So we find that against other codes of law, there is a tremendously higher standard. And of course what it's doing is reflecting the fact that human beings are created in the image of God, and He values all human life. And so as they would live by this Torah, by this rule of life among other nations, they would be a distinctive people. And the nations would see that. And, for instance, it would start, you put them in Canaan, right here in the middle of everything. You've got all the Mesopotamia, where these great centers of civilization were, and you have Egypt. And He drops Israel right in the middle. They don't have much, but they're on the trade routes. And everybody goes through there. Well, if you go through there on the Sabbath and you want to trade, what is a Jewish person respectful of Torah going to tell you? have a rest. We'll do it in the morning. Oh, why can't we do it today? I don't see any, problem. Well, our God says this is the Sabbath, and He gives us rest. Oh, what else does your God do? I mean, He just put them there to be a testimony to the rest of the world. And Torah, in its uniqueness and the way it values human life and the way it reflects the character of God, informed them as to how to live so that they could be that priestly kingdom to the rest of the kingdoms. And fourthly, biblical law includes worship practice as a part of the law. No other law code includes the whole thing of religion and sacrificial system of the priesthood. But in Exodus and in Leviticus, it's all enfolded because it's all one. And that will bring us to just thinking about the temple. And so Exodus, while it is the establishment of the covenant, also has the instruction for the tabernacle and the apparatus by which their relationship would be carried on. And so in chapters 25 through 40, we find instruction for the tabernacle and the garments of the priests. We find the threat to the covenant's viability being dealt with in chapters 32 to 34, the preservation of the covenant, and then the construction of the tabernacle. So again, the uniqueness of Torah, the uniqueness of the way this covenant relationship is struck against the background of the ancient world, highlights the fact that this is the God of Israel who is to be worshipped. The God who invokes His character in terms of the morality of the people. The God who takes sin seriously and who defines and is the definition of sin in regard to the violation of His standard, and who has to provide a way for people to come into His presence. And we will look just briefly at the idea of tent and tabernacle and so forth on Friday before we get into the book of Leviticus.